Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about Grace Beats Karma, Letters from Prison 1958 to 1960 by Neal Cassady. It's kind of cool to have a book that's by Neal Cassady because he didn't actually publish any books or works during his lifetime. This is a collection of letters that was published in the early 90s, well after he was dead. But this is the second book of collected letters by Neal Cassady that I've read. The other one was Neal Cassady's Collected Letters, which was published in the early 2000s. But as far as I know, none of the letters in this book are included in his Collected Letters. So this book is definitely unique. It definitely has stuff that's not included elsewhere. But I will also say that none of the letters in this book are really that noteworthy. There's nothing that I read in this book that really was that interesting. I knew most of the stuff that I read about. It's just kind of cool to have a book that's by Neal Cassady, even though, it's nothing really that spectacular about this book. And it's mostly letters that he sent to his wife, Carolyn, and to a priest that he knew. I believe the priest was someone he knew from growing up in Denver. And this book the writing style is very spontaneous. I think with the collected letters of Neal Cassady, in that book, you really see the evolution of his letters over time. You see how things change. But in this book, it's from one specific time period, late 1950s, early 1960s. And during that time period, he really perfected this spontaneous writing style. It's a little more raw than Jack Kerouac's spontaneous prose style. It's just kind of rambling, just kind of moving from thought to thought, bouncing around. You really see how his mind worked by reading the letters here. This is really just the peak time of him writing this very rambling, spontaneous style of writing. It's a little too rambling for me. A lot of times I get bored halfway through one of his letters and just kind of wait, what did I read? Or having to go back and reread things again sometimes. But it's very artistic the way he writes. Like I said in other videos, Neal Cassady was kind of just kind of changing the mold of what writing could be, what writing was supposed to be. He just put raw thoughts on the paper. So one good thing I can say about this book is that it's definitely, a reflection of that style. It's definitely, like I said, the peak, I think, form that he wrote when he was writing this style. And it's also very religious. He reflects a lot on his Catholic faith. He reflects on the writings of Edgar Cayce, and he kind of dabbles a little bit in Eastern religion and Eastern ideas. I mean, the title, Grace Beats Karma, I think is a good representation of that, where he's kind of dabbling in Christian ideas and Eastern ideas at the same time. But he's just a person who is into everything, every kind of philosophical thought, religious idea, he was just into. He loved just to learn new things. And this book's a good reflection of that. It's just him rambling about random religious and philosophical things, writing letters to his wife. Definitely just a very strange book, and it's intentionally, I think, meant to be that way. I think the reason that it's so religious is because he was in jail. He was trying to be pure. He was trying to reinvent himself. And I think he was just reading a lot about religion, just reflecting a lot on faith and stuff like that. So that's why he wrote a lot about religion while he's in jail. But I think it's also just, you see in his writing that he operated on a different plane of existence of normal people. His thoughts were not the way normal people thought. And you definitely see that the Beats were different from everyone else. They were definitely operating differently than the rest of mainstream society. And this was a time period of Cold War paranoia. And these people are here just rambling about poetry and religion and philosophy and just everything contrary to what pop culture is. The Beats are, and his writings here and his letters are definitely a good reflection of that. And Neal Cassady's imprisonment is also a very good representation of this time period, because he was arrested for selling a couple of joints to some undercover agents, and he was in jail for a little over 2 years. So obviously today, no one would go to jail for selling a couple of joints to some undercover agents, but this also just represents this crackdown that was happening on people who represented rebellion and just anything that was contrary to mainstream, because Neal Cassady became somewhat well known for being the character Dean Moriarty in Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So he caught the attention of a lot of people, and that's definitely the reason why he was arrested. They knew who he was. They were cracking down on people like this who represented, rebellion in America. And a lot of that was happening during that time period. And this was right after Allen Ginsberg, the trial of his collected poems, Howl, and there was an obscenity trial where they didn't want to have it published for having obscene stuff in his writing. And it was known that Neal Cassady was an acquaintance of Allen Ginsberg. So also when the trial happened, that they talked about how, he was part of this group of people who were seen as being very rebellious in America. But I think what his imprisonment represents is that the freedom of the Beats, this freedom and adventure and kicks of the Beat generation was starting to butt up against the social order that existed in the 1950s. It was no longer just this group of friends who were just traveling around America having fun. People started to see them as a serious threat to society in America. So these people were seen as very bad people in the eyes of the law. I think what you're starting to see with things like the Howell trial and Neal Cassady's arrest and imprisonment, you're starting to see a real counterculture form, this real movement forming that people are trying to fight back against. So you see the subculture of the Beats is starting to become an actual counterculture in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And I think in the eyes of mainstream society, there was really this us versus them mentality really starting to form. And Neal Cassady represented the them to everyone else in society. And if you look at the cover of this book, you see this picture of Neal Cassady with his children. Neal Cassady's looking like a very 1950s person, just a very well put together looking person. And it's kind of interesting when you read about all the things that the Beats did and you see what they looked like. And they just looked like people from the 1950s. It wasn't really this, in 1960s, counterculture had a specific look that people looked like. That wasn't the case in the 1950s. They were just normal people who lived very interesting lives. And during the trial that Neal Cassady was in for his arrest, they talked about how he was a family man. I think they even showed pictures of him with his family and with the kids. And what that actually did actually hurt him because it made it seem like he had this double life where he was this family guy but was selling drugs on the side. So he just came off as this person living this double life, and it didn't work well for him in court. But it is interesting, once again, just how I think the idea of what counterculture was still very much developing. And you can see what people looked, it wasn't really what you think. And Neal Cassady, once again, is just a good representation of that change happening in America. But getting back to this book, I would say most of the letters in this book are too rambling for me. It's not really a style of writing that I enjoy reading. I'm very interested in the overall context of his writing and what was going on, but his writing style itself is just a little too rambling for me. The couple letters he has to his children in here are interesting. It's cool to see that he really cared about his children. He definitely had an interest in his children. But once again, Neal Cassady lived a life where he wasn't always very nice to his family. He didn't really put his family first. So it's definitely, I think, interesting reading about how much he loved his children, how nice he was to them. But he also lived this life that he wasn't really a family man. He didn't really make a lot of good decisions that were helpful to his family. But I would say the biggest drawback of this book is that it's just letters that Neal Cassady sent. You don't see the responses that his wife sent him. It's very one-sided. You just get his side of the conversation. But once again, it's a collection of his writings, so I'm sure it's very much intentional. But you just feel like you're missing the full conversation sometimes when you're reading his letters. There's just a lot, I think, left to be wanted after finishing this book. But surprisingly, I think my favorite part of this book isn't something that's actually written by Neal Cassady. There's this little writing here by Allen Ginsberg. It's literally 3 pages, but it's called Poetry, Violence, and the Trembling Lambs. And what this little piece of writing here is, it talks about how the idea of authentic living was starting to come in contact with violence and repression during the 1950s. And he just kind of goes on a little bit talking about that. Talks about how poetry is kind of like the opposite side of repression. And it just talks about how poetry was really becoming some kind of like a weapon against repression. I think it's definitely more relevant today. When I read this, I was like, wow, this really sounds like it could have been written today in Trump's America. It's just talking about repression and authoritarianism and just living authentic when there's this force that's trying to fight against authenticity. And that's definitely what I think the 1960s really represented. But I think Allen Ginsberg's piece of writing here really represents how the kicks and joy and adventures of the Beat generation was starting to shift into something more spiritual, more political, more of this consciousness revolution that you think of when you think of counterculture in the 1960s. But I think this little piece of writing here is very reflective of the whole book. It definitely, after you read that, it makes you look back on what you just read a little differently. You see that Neal Cassady's life and his imprisonment really represented this shift. I think Neal Cassady is really this bridge between the Beats and the counterculture of the 1960s. He's definitely a very significant person. He doesn't get nowhere near as much attention as he should as far as his impact on counterculture and even pop culture in America. But yeah, that's Grace Beats Karma by Neal Cassady. Would I recommend reading it? If you're really, really interested in Neal Cassady and want to know as much as you can about him, yes, I would recommend reading it just so you can see some of his writing when he was in jail. But if you just want to just see what his writing was like, I think you want to read his collected letters. That gives you way more insight, way more depth into his writing, and you see his writing change over time. But this is a snapshot of one specific time period in his life when he was in jail. You definitely see what his writing style was like during that time period, but this was once again not his best time for writing. I think a little earlier when he was just starting to develop this real spontaneous writing style was a little better. By this point, it was just a little more rambling and not really that interesting to read at this point. But anyway, that's Grace Beats Karma. So be sure to subscribe and we'll see you in the next video.